Okay, well, thank you very much. And again, apologies for being so late. So I started in the civil service in 1983. I did so by accident, actually, funnily enough. I was a student and I was trying to work out what I was going to do next. And I saw this advert saying the civil service would pay for me to go and do a master's course in economics, which I was an economist at the time, or a budding economist. And I didn't really know anything about the civil service, to be quite honest. So I went along to this interview and they said, why don't you come and work for us for a couple of years and then we'll send you off to the London School of Economics to do a master's degree in economics after you've worked in the civil service for a couple of years. So, without really knowing anything about the civil service, I found myself in the civil service. And I went to an organisation called the Health and Safety Executive, which, some of you will have heard of probably, but others won't have done. They were in charge, they still are in charge, of making sure that factories, as we had in 1983, places of work as we have now, farms, nuclear power stations, you name it, places of work, were safe for people to work in. So they employed 2 economists, and I was one of the 2. Our job was to work out, what was the right amount of safety regulation to have in the country, really, to make sure that we got the right balance between allowing companies to make profits and create jobs, but at the same time keeping the workers safe. So that was an absolutely fascinating sort of opening job. I'd never heard of the Health and Safety Executive before. I had no idea it was part of the civil service. As I say, I didn't really know what the civil service was. But I did know straight away that within about 1 day of joining, I was doing really important work for the country. So I did that for a year. And then someone persuaded me to work for the Treasury, which is where most of the economists working in the civil service used to work in those days anyway. And since then, I basically, as you've done the maths yourselves, I've been in the civil service for just over 30 years, about a third of that time in the Treasury, a third of that time in the Cabinet Office. But one of the great things about the civil service is you can sort of dip in and out. So at different times I've worked, for example, I worked for 2 years in America, the International Monetary Fund, which looks after lending to lots of developing countries and tries to make sure that the world economy as a whole sort of works well for everybody. So I had a couple of very good years there. I was allowed to just go off and work in America for a couple of years. I spent 3.5 years in the city. I took a sort of leave of absence from the civil service and went off to work for an American investment bank, which was a very different experience, which we can talk about later. But it's always good for the soul to try something different. I did spend a year at the London School of Economics, paid for by the civil service, learning some economics. So the nice thing about the civil service is you can sort of go and work for one organisation for a bit, maybe go and dip out for a bit somewhere else, go and work abroad for a while, and you can sort of mix around like that. So anyway, for the last 6 or 7 years I've been Cabinet Secretary, and the last few years I've also been the head of the civil service. So let me just tell you a little bit about that so you've sort of flavour of what I do now. So it's basically, although usually these jobs are combined, they're not always combined, so they are 2 very distinct jobs. So the Cabinet Secretary's job is basically to be the main civil service policy advisor to the Prime Minister and to make sure that the Cabinet, which is chaired by the Prime Minister, actually does its job properly. So every week we have a meeting of all the ministers in the Cabinet. It's about 20 odd ministers. The Prime Minister chairs the meeting. I sit next to the Prime Minister. It's my job to work with the Prime Minister to make sure that the Cabinet is discussing the issues that the country needs the Cabinet to decide, and to make sure that the discussion is properly, accurately recorded. We still write it in pen, in longhand. There's no videos in the Cabinet. So my notebook is the official record of what's been discussed, and then my staff and myself get that typed up, and we sort of have a formal record, which then about 20 years later gets published as a sort of historical record. So that is a piece of British history that we're writing. So a combination of advising the Prime Minister on policy questions. So one of the reasons I'm slightly late today is we've had a little bit of a crisis because we've been trying to get the Northern Ireland parties, political parties in Northern Ireland, to come together to agree to re-establish devolved government in Northern Ireland. They've just broken up in disarray this afternoon. So we're having to deal with that today. So whatever the issue of the day is, I'm obviously available to the Prime Minister and making sure that she's got the advice that she needs from the civil service as well as from her political advisors. So that's the sort of Cabinet Secretary part of the job. Policy, writing written papers to the Prime Minister, talking to her about the issues, obviously working with lots of other people as well. It's not just me, lots of other people do that. That's not that side of the job. But then the second part of the job, which, as I say, normally goes together with the first, but not always, is head of the civil service. So the civil service is 400,000 people-ish. It's been shrinking in size as we use modern technology to do some of the clerical jobs that used to be done by people. Though there's still, lots and lots of people across the country who are employed by the civil service. And we're split into 20 or 25 different government departments. And my job is to sit on top of all of those 400,000 people, and make sure that they work for the country in the way that we would want. So, we do things like the people who work in prisons, for example, they're civil servants. The people who work in job centres, they're civil servants. People in the National Health Service are not. So actually there are lots of people working in the public sector who are not classified as civil servants. So it's a little bit arbitrary as to whether you're a civil servant or not. But fundamentally, the public services on which most of us depend as citizens, you'll find a civil servant somewhere, either helping to administer that or actually helping to devise the policy that goes behind that. And it's lots of people who work in the Foreign Office, who work in embassies abroad, for example. It's a different sort of job in the civil service, but part of the civil service. You've got spies, people, I think technically they're not classified as civil servants, but they come to my meetings. So you've got spies, and you've got diplomats, and you've got people working Job Centre Plus, and you've got people working on climate change, you've got people working on Northern Ireland, you've got people working on schools. Basically, most of the public services that you can think of, the civil service is involved in one shape or form. And what generally happens is people join one department, so they might join the Department for Education, and they might be working on schools and universities and apprenticeships, and then most people tend to stay in that department for a while. Some people do a little bit like I did, which is they work for one department and then they go and work, they do maybe 5 or 10 years working on schools policy or something like that, and then decide, you know what, I want to go and work on overseas aid for a bit, because that's an interesting topic, and we have the flexibility to do that sort of thing as well. So that's a sort of quick potted history of my career, a quick flavour as to the two parts of my job. I'm happy to carry on talking for as long as you like, but it probably is best if you just ask me lots of questions and we can have a conversation.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. I found it fascinating how you went into the civil service, but it wasn't necessarily your initial intention.
Yeah, exactly. Not at all. But I was delighted. Within about a week, I was delighted about this organisation. That's right. So who wants to ask? I might just check it off.
We're now going to move on to the next part of our session, which is the Q&A section.
Yep.
We'll ask 3 questions at a time for the sake of efficiency. So we're going to have each person say their questions, 3 of them, and then if you could then respond.
Sure.
Afterwards.
Okay. Questions.
Thank you very much. So first, question 1 is Felicity.
Good evening, Sir Jeremy.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. My name is Felicity. What is an average day like for you in your role?
An average day. Okay, so you want me to answer 3 at a time?
Yes, please. Next is Asif.
Good evening, sir. Jeremy, thank you for being here, giving us your time. My name is Asif, and the question I have for you is, what 3 qualities or skills make a successful cabinet secretary?
Okay.
Yes. And question 3, Sega.
Thank you for being here, Sir Jeremy. My name is Sam. My question is, what has been the most difficult moments in your time as Cabinet Secretary, and how have you overcome them?
Right, okay. So my average day starts at about 6:30 when I click open my iPhone and work out how many emails have come in overnight and how many look at my tweets. Usually 10, 15, 20 things have to be attended to at about that time. I then go into the office. Usually I'm in the office for about 8. The Prime Minister has a meeting usually 8:30 most mornings, not on Fridays. She's in her constituency on Fridays because she remains a very passionate constituency MP. So from 8:30 onwards, I'm really in meetings with the Prime Minister. On Tuesdays, I have cabinet meetings that start at 9:30 that goes on for an hour and a half. And I'm meeting my members of staff, or I'm meeting ministers, or I'm with the Prime Minister discussing policy with her. I try and get out a bit on Thursdays and Fridays, go and see some of the civil servants working outside London. Obviously, most of the civil service works outside London. And it's just a nice mixture of sort of policy issues that I say. I mean, a lot of it, probably a little bit too much around a desk, but that's just because I'm Cabinet Secretary. I think most people in the civil service get to travel around a bit more than I do. But that's the price you pay for getting towards the top of the civil service. Lots of emails, lots of Twitter, lots of reacting to news and that sort of thing. Although the most important thing is to try and stay somewhat in formation rather than just chasing every issue, because you've got coming on to the sort of qualities and skills. One of the most important things by far is building a team around you, so that you can actually rely upon the people running the different departments and the team you've got working for you to actually, I wouldn't say do all the work, because obviously I do some work as well, but you can't do it all yourself. You've really got to be organised so that individual issues, when they come out, so Northern Ireland, for example, I can come out here tonight to talk to you because I know that I've got a person sitting in Belfast who is actually thinking about the issues, is writing a paper for the Prime Minister, and I don't have to do that myself. So again, the 3 quality skills, I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint 3, but I would say definitely hard work. You can't get to become Cabinet Secretary without being pretty dedicated to the job. It's a hard-working life. You've got to be prepared, and that obviously requires you, I think, to be interested in the work. I mean, if you're not interested in politics, if you're not interested in public service, if you're not interested in improving things for the country, you probably wouldn't be prepared to do the hours. Definitely delegation and teamwork. You've got to build a team around you who are not all like you. You basically got to have. I'm quite an introverted person. I need some extroverts around me. I need experts on all the different policy areas. So you've got to have that sort of blend of people with different backgrounds, different genders, different race, obviously, and so on. And I think the other thing that I would probably single out, delegation, hard work. I would say, I mean, we've got these values, civil service values, honesty, integrity. You can't get very far in the civil service if you're not prepared to, be a person of integrity. You've got to be able to speak truth to power. We've got elected ministers who have a mandate from the people of Britain, so they're in charge. That's the way our system works, our democratic system. But your job as a civil servant is to tell them when you think they're making a mistake, or when they ask you what is the best way of achieving this objective. What are you? You've got to be prepared to sort of stand up to them and say, I genuinely believe this is the way you should do things. And if you haven't got that sort of integrity and that willingness to speak truth under power, then you won't get very far. It's easy to sort of say the easy thing, but there's so many different skills. I mean, there's so many different sorts of civil service job that it's quite difficult to pick out just sort of 3 qualities. Difficult moments. Well, I mean, the most sort of, we've had some very difficult moments. If I think back, I mean, the day, for example, the Twin Towers, I was sitting in Downing Street, 9/11, and we were watching on the TV screens the aeroplanes going into the Twin Towers. And then Tony Blair, who was then Prime Minister, phoned me and said, "Are you sure there aren't any planes coming towards Downing Street?" And I'm thinking, oh God, I hadn't even thought of that. And then there's a sort of half an hour of sort of real anxiety as you try and work out what on earth is happening in the world. Whereas for most of it, it's just something happening on the TV screens. When you're sitting next to the British Prime Minister, there's a genuine question about, what does Britain do about this? Should we evacuate Downing Street? So you get moments like that of massive national crisis, where you're sort of in the middle of it all. Another one was during the financial crisis, 2008-9. Some of you will remember that, when it looked at one point as if the British banks were all going to run out of money in sort of half an hour, and there was a blind panic on the streets. Again, we just had to keep our calm and just sort of try and work through the issues and what can we actually do about the situation. Then there are other issues like, for example, when you have a general election, you just don't know. You wait for the exit poll, and depending on where the exit poll goes, you could be working for that person or that person tomorrow. And that's a stressful moment. The civil service has to be prepared to work for any government, any party. If you can't be politically neutral like that, you don't join the civil service. But obviously that can make a big difference depending on whether it's that party or that party, because it's a totally different agenda sometimes. So those are moments of, they're not difficult in a sense, but they're quite stressful and they're quite exciting. For many people, many civil servants, it's the most exciting thing of all. When there's a general election, you get to change governments and you get to sort of help a new government settle in, and that's a very rare privilege. So I wouldn't say any of this is difficult, but it's there are moments of stress and drama and crisis where you've just got to be able to keep your calm. More questions?
Yes, thank you very much. Next is question 4, Ryan.
Thank you for being here today, Sir Jeremy. My name is
By the way, you
Ryan.
don't need to call me sir. Just call me Jeremy. That's fine.
As the head of the civil service, what do you think will be the challenges ahead for the next 5 years?
Yes.
I've just worked out these are the list. This is the list of questions here, so I don't have to write them down. It's good.
Okay.
Good. Right. Finally, don't get to the top of the civil service, you know. Right.
And question 6. Amin.
Yes, Mr. Jeremy, thank you for being here. My question is, what advice would you give to future cabinet secretaries?
Is that we look forward?
Yes.
I've lost concentration here.
The next is question 8.
It's
is
4,
unique.
6, and 8.
Yes.
Okay, right.
Thank you for being here. My name is Leonie. My question is, you have served under 2 prime ministers. And from your perspective, has there been a cabinet which has stood out the most, and for what reason?
That's a very dangerous question. Right, so I wasn't concentrating carefully because I thought I'd cracked the code here. So number 4, what will be the challenges of the next 5 years? Is that the one? Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. Well, it's very difficult to predict the next 5 years. The next period ahead, the biggest challenge we've got as a civil service is helping the government execute a smooth exit from the European Union. It's a very, very complicated project, hundreds of work streams, and it's got legislation, it's got negotiation with other European countries, it's got discussion with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland about how they're going to manage with that. It's got planning for different alternative once we leave the European Union and so on. So it's a massive project which is involving hundreds and eventually thousands of civil servants. And I think that, even though the bulk of the work we hope to get done this year, I suspect that will be a big project for some years to come. I think, what else would I pick out? I mean, I think we've still got a very big problem as a country in terms of our productivity. If you look at how productive the UK is in terms of the output we produce per, given the number of people working and the hours they work, we're about 20% less productive than a lot of our European partners. So successive governments actually, but certainly this government is very keen to sort of try and understand how we can raise productivity in the country. We've got our public services, which every year face stress. I mean, the National Health Service has been through another very tough winter, so that's always going to be an issue that needs to be worked on. We've got a very, very positive, I would say, environmental agenda after the Blue Planet programs, and there's been a lot of focus on this, plastic and so on, air quality. I mean, basically, the thing about the civil service is, and the thing about being cabinet secretary is, we deal with everything. So obviously individual governments come and go and decide to prioritise particular things, and then you get once in a generation issues like Brexit. But the issues that face the country are the ones that we have to deal with. So whatever you perceive as a group of young people, the country needs fixing. That's what we're going to be working on for the next 5 years. What advice would I give to future cabinet secretaries? Well, it's a great job, so I would sort of stick at it. My view is the civil service is a great organisation. I mean, obviously I would say that, wouldn't I? But I mean, we've endured for 160 years now, and we've got the same values. Impartiality, objectivity, honesty, integrity. These are the core pillars of the UK civil service. I think we're envied across the world, where compared to some other countries where they have corruption problems, or you have people getting jobs not on merit but because of who they know. We've got those sorts of, we believe that it's a meritocracy, that people should get in on their merit through open competition and so on. And my basic advice to future cabinet secretaries is don't break the model, because I think the model basically works and serves the country really well. And stick with it, because I feel very privileged to do this job. It's a wonderful job. It's very tough, but if you're working on the issues that affect the country, what finer thing to be working on, to be honest. In terms of prime ministers, I've actually worked for 4 prime ministers, not 2. I've worked for 2 as cabinet secretary, but I worked really closely with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown as well, in a slightly more junior position, but working very closely with them. And I'm simply not going to answer the question about...
Very diplomatic. Yes, thank you.
I've got to be impartial.
Very good. Next is question 12 from Kua.
Thank you, Sir Jeremy, for
Hi.
being here. From your experience in leading the civil service, what attributes do you think are most important to be a good leader?
Good leader, yeah.
Next is question 13 from Priscilla.
Thank you for being here. My name is Priscilla, and my question is, what advice would you give to young people from underrepresented backgrounds who either feel hindered or are a bit afraid to join the civil service? What advice would you give them?
Okay.
Yes. And also question 14, which is Krishna.
Thank you for being here today. My name is Krishna. I wanted to ask, what has been the most valuable lesson you've learned while being in the civil service?
Okay, great. So, good leader. Well, I think in some ways this links with what I said earlier about the qualities needed to be sort of cabinet secretary. I mean, you've got to be able to build a very strong team. An organisation of 400,000 people, or even in the bit of the civil service I work in, the cabinet office, where you've got small numbers of thousands, you can't do it all yourself, and nor does any one individual have the personal qualities necessary to sort of get everything right. You've got to build a team of people who are a diverse group, who have different characteristics from you, both personally and sort of in background-wise. Otherwise, you get sort of captured by one view of the world, groupthink. So building and motivating a team of diverse individuals, creating a culture in which it's safe to challenge, I think is really important as well. So that people, aren't scared of you. The danger of my job is because you get so senior, people just think, oh, well, he's the boss, whatever he says. If that is a disastrous culture to have, you've got to have a culture in which anybody, no matter how junior, no matter how inexperienced, can come in and say, actually, that doesn't look right. Look at something with fresh eyes. That's what the country needs. And so, as a leader, you've got to encourage that sense of challenge. But also, I think that sense of the values of the civil service, as I said. So you've got to have a good sense of what is the organisation's values. Why has the civil service survived 160 years? It's because fundamentally, the country wants to have a bureaucracy which is not corrupt, is meritocratic, is based on impartiality and objectivity and so on. And so you've got to be able to sort of communicate those values, you've got to live those values. So a leader who lives the values, creates a sense of challenge and builds a strong, diverse team. I think those were the things that I would probably single out on that one. Advice to young people from underrepresented communities. I mean, first of all, I would say, well, you should come and look at the civil service because we are getting increasingly large numbers of people applying from that sort of background. As some of you will know, we have a fast stream, which is our graduate entrance. I think something like 16% of the job offers this year will go to people from underrepresented black and ethnic minority backgrounds. 16%, which I think is a pretty good sort of reflection of UK society. We have diversity in internship schemes, so people who are thinking about applying but are not quite ready. I think we've now got about 400 places on that scheme in the summer. So we are very, very determined to make the civil service a welcoming place for people from your communities or from communities that are currently underrepresented. It's an absolute passion of mine that we don't just do that at entry level, whether it's through the apprenticeship scheme or through the graduate scheme or through just individual schemes, but then we then follow that through so that we get to the senior civil service, which are people basically mid-30s onwards. There's an equal representation there. That's what we're not good enough at the moment, and that's what we're really focusing in on. But I would like to think that we are a meritocratic organisation. That the people at the top of the civil service, me and my direct reports, are totally committed to keeping that. We haven't been good enough in the past, and that's the situation we've inherited. But for the last 2 or 3 years, it's been a massive priority. I think we started on this a few years earlier when it came to the gender balance within the senior civil service, and we're now getting to a point where 50% of the people coming into the senior civil service in the last year were women. So if we can do it for women, we can do it for all other groups that are currently underrepresented, and that's absolutely our total determination. So what's been my most valuable lesson since working in the civil service? I I think this is really about teamwork, I would say. I mean, these things sound a little bit sort of trite and a bit obvious in a way. But when you first join the civil service, you just think, like, you know, I come out of university, or I'm an apprentice, you know, you feel master or mistress of your own destiny. You gradually realise that you can only get things done efficiently and effectively if you're working with a team of people. And pretty much wherever you are in the civil service, you end up building a close bond around you of your boss, or then you become the boss yourself, and then it's your job to bring people on. And it's not just people working in your team, it's making sure that your team is working well with other teams. That is, you know, the most important thing in a way. It's a community you're joining. It's a family, if you like, and you never forget that. And you quickly understand that that things can only be done. It's the same. It's the same amongst the politicians. The Prime Minister can't get things done unless she brings the rest of the cabinet with her, which. You know, you'll be able to form your own judgment from the newspapers as to whether she's doing that. But teamwork, and I also, the thing that I didn't really understand about the civil service, but I finally got to understand what I joined back in 1983, was, you know, the civil service. It sounds like one big organisation, but if you sort of take the lid off, you see it's loads and loads of other organisations under one big umbrella. And, you know, what I would really emphasise to you, if you're thinking about working in the civil service or want to know about the civil service, is it's the best of both worlds in a sense. It's being one organisation which allows you to move around, but then fundamentally you can be working on very different things from one year to the next. If you decide you want to move from, as I say, if you want to, you might want to work in Africa on overseas aid 1 year, and then the next year you might apply for a job working on National Health Service policy or working on climate change. And you're still part of the civil service. You've still got the same broad terms and conditions. There's some variations between departments, but fundamentally you're in the same organisation, and it's quite easy to move around once you're in. So that's something which I didn't know when I first joined.
Yes, thank you very much. Last 3 questions, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So you got 16. That's Mira, please.
Good evening. Thanks for being here today. My name is Samira, and my question is, what has been your single largest barrier, obstacle, in your career, and how have you overcome it?
Yeah.
Right.
And question 17, please. Iltika.
Thank you for taking the time to be here. My name is Jessica, and my question is, what kind of legacy would you like to leave behind?
And the final question, number 15. Question hopping. Diane, please.
Thank you for being here, sir. My question is, what do you know now that you wish you knew at the start of your civil service career?
Right, okay. So, largest barrier or obstacle. To be honest, I struggle to answer this question. I think really in the civil service the largest barrier is your own personal sort of aspiration and ambition. I mean, we have brilliant training courses, we have great leaders, we have great managers, we have huge opportunities. Some people seize those opportunities and decide they really want to sort of move up and move on. Others say, you know, I'm perfectly happy with my 9-to-5 job, I've got my family to look after, I get well paid, that's fine. So, you know, there have been times in my career when I've just basically I've been trading water for a bit because that was just what motivated me. Other times there's been an opportunity, and my general view is if people want to grasp those opportunities, they're there. And I would like to think we have built a civil service where there aren't irrational barriers. And maybe this is the problem, you get deluded when you get to the top of an organisation. But you know, we are constantly struggling, we're constantly striving to overcome irrational barriers. We want to be a meritocratic organisation in which people who want to get on and can rise as high as their ambition wants to take them. And that's the civil service I want to lead. Legacy, was that the next question?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm getting confused here with my own writing. Well, the legacy, I think I've already hinted at this in a way. I mean, I think we are a brilliant civil service. I think we are trying to measure ourselves against other civil services with data and metrics and so on. We have basically over the last few years identified 3 areas that we want to really change. I think we, as I say, we're great as an organisation, and I think we're an asset to the country, but we're not as commercial as we should be. So if you look at the very, very best private sector organisations, they're probably more clinical when it comes to doing commercial deals, and we need to be better at that. So we're recruiting lots of people from outside the civil service to make ourselves more commercial, so that we don't waste the taxpayers' money and we can keep taxes down for the government. The second area is we need to be more digital. You guys are probably all more digital than anybody in the civil service because you're younger. We need to be, as digital as Amazon. I had breakfast the other day with the head of Amazon in the UK. We can learn a lot from them. There's no reason at all why the civil service can't be just as good at digital. We have loads of public services are available online now on mobile phones and so on, but they need to be as good as the best private sector services. But then above all, we need to be more diverse in our senior civil service. As I said, I think our fast stream entry, our apprenticeships, I think people coming in at the bottom of the civil service reflect the country. I think you would feel completely at home. Anybody in this audience today will feel completely at home. The question is, can we make sure that we carry that through up into the senior civil service? And that is, so if I've got a single thing that I will, retire happily on if I've fixed, it is making sure that the senior civil service looks like Britain. And that's one of the reasons I'm here today. What was the final question again?
Oh yes. What do you know now that you wish you knew start your career? Yes.
I don't know. But as I say, I wish I'd known what the civil service was when I joined it. No, look, I've learned a lot about the civil service, but I don't think any of that mattered. It doesn't really matter. You can stumble into the civil service. You can, enjoy your first job, and you can then look around, see what comes next, and there are no barriers in my view to any of you going forward. And I don't think you don't need a game plan. You don't need to know all about the civil service. It's a place which takes people as they are and helps them progress. And I honestly, I'd have to make up an answer to that one, so I can't make an answer.
Yes. Thank you very much. Round
Round
of applause, everyone. Amazing masterclass. So everyone will agree that we all found it very insightful. Would you be prepared to take a photo?